Well, welcome everybody to today's second event in our webinar series on paperless trade and trying to shine the spotlight onto different things which are going on around the world, and in particular that Australians have been involved with. Today's special guest is Steve Capell. Steve runs a boutique consultancy in Canberra called GoSource, and he provides digital strategy and support services to the Australian government agencies, including Border Force and Climate Change, and the Department of Agriculture, amongst others. But he's also part of the UN Centre for Trade Facilitation Electronic Business, UN CEFACT. So following on from the conversation we had last week, which you can go back and view on our website if you like, with Ian Watt around what the UN does, now we're getting a little bit more granular. Steve has been contributing to digital standards and trade facilitation for around 20 years. And in this capacity, he has led 3 projects that are relevant to the discussion today. So the republishing of the UN CEFACT Buy-Ship-Pay reference data model as a modern web vocabulary, a white paper involving the guidance for nations on use of verifiable credentials. And this is something we'll be talking about today. And then interoperability and scaling framework for the UNECE textile and leather traceability project. So he has vast experience, and I'm certain there's a lot more we can say about you, but we'd really rather hear from you, Steve. And so perhaps if you'd like to start your presentation, which is going to last for about 30 minutes, and then we will have questions and interaction with the audience. As with last week, if audience members can use the Q&A function, then we can follow along and ask the questions. So feel free to ask those as you like, and then I will try and direct them later on. But Steve, perhaps over to you first for your presentation, and then we can have the discussion after that.
All right. Thank you, Brian.
You're not yet on full screen. Here we go.
Yeah. Takes a couple of seconds to think about it when you go full screen. Here we go.
Here we go.
Right, and you're seeing the full screen, right?
Got it.
Okay. Well, look, thank you everyone for your time. I'm going to chat today about digital trust in international supply chains, and particularly how it applies to ESG, that's environmental and social governance concerns and criteria, and increasing amounts of border regulation over those criteria. So as Brian said, 30 minutes or so of conversation about what are verifiable credentials, what are decentralized identifiers, why do I care about them, and how does it apply to cross-border supply chains and ESG, and then 20 to 30 minutes on open questions and Q&A. Keep me honest, Brian, on timing. I'm going to try and make sure that I give ourselves plenty of time for conversation. So I'm going to assume zero knowledge, and forgive me for those that already know all this, but it's always good to start from the beginning. And I'll start by reminding everyone what a credential is. Never mind a verifiable credential, just a credential. Here's a few that you're all familiar with, and we might call these personal credentials, right? My driver's license, my degree certificate, or my traveler record, immunization. You assess whether they look real by inspection, don't you? Very hard to verify them, and some are harder to fake than others. There's also credentials that are linked not with individuals, but with businesses. For example, a business registration certificate, or a professional indemnity insurance, or a quality certificate. Also, certificates of value and or credentials of value, and varying degrees of fakeability. And finally, credentials also apply to things, right? So shipments, like a bill of lading, that's a credential associated with a consignment, phytosanitary cert similar, or a commercial invoice. So all of these are meaningful and valuable credentials today. So what's a verifiable credential? Well, put simply, it's a digital version of those things, right? Except that it's got a few extra sweet attributes. One is that it's digital, so machines can read them. That's quite valuable by itself. And I'll jump to the last bullet and then come back to the others. One of the cool features about verifiable credentials is they're also human readable. because you can attach a rendering template to the digital data so that you can look at it, and it looks just like the credentials I showed before that we're all familiar with, but there's accessible and verifiable digital data behind it. That's quite a powerful feature of verifiable credentials, because it allows you to bridge what are very intensive paper processes without demanding a lot of technical maturity from some actors in the supply chain. Another thing about a digital verifiable credential, of course, is it's verifiable. That means it's tamper evident. You know who signed it and it hasn't been changed. It's revocable, also very valuable for some types of credentials like a visa. If the traveler is no longer entitled, a paper document is not revocable, whereas a digital one, as soon as you try to verify it after it's revoked, it says so, it's revoked. Another really interesting feature is it's redactable. What do I mean by that? It means that I, as a holder of a credential, can choose to hide certain information. For example, I've got a digital driver's license and I want to buy alcohol from a bottle shop, and I only want to prove I'm over 18 without releasing a whole bunch of private information. I can do that with a digital credential. Similarly, in long supply chains, the more you reach deeper into supply chains in traceability and transparency initiatives, the more reluctance you encounter to share data, because every participant is doing battle, if you like, between transparency obligations and commercial sensitivity concerns. And so if you can choose to hide certain information from credentials, but still pass them through the supply chain and make the rest of the information verifiable, that opens up or reduces a lot of concerns. And finally, it's portable. It's got a different exchange mechanism to most other data. And we'll see that in the next slide. You own it and you show it to whoever you want. Here's an example of a digital verifiable credential that many of you have already seen. If you're not European, you wouldn't have had these issued to you, but there's a similar looking Australian one. Is an example of something that is both digital and paper. It's not quite a W3C verifiable credential, but you get the idea that that QR code contains your COVID vaccination information, and it's signed by the issuing country and therefore high integrity and verifiable. Let's just get on to how a VC is used. And this idea of issuer holder verifier is really important, right? The most fundamental idea about verifiable credential is that it's a portable verifiable data packet, right? So it's issued to a holder who owns it, who's the subject of it, right? If it's me and it's my degree certificate, then the university is the issuer and I'm the holder. And I can choose to present it to whoever I choose, such as an employer that might want to employ me. And that verifier, the employer, needs make no contact with the issuer. And that decoupling between issuer and verifier is quite important for both for privacy, but also for scalability. It means that there doesn't need to be any previous integration between an employer system and a university system for this to work, because I carry the data and I show it to you, basically. Right? So this idea that a VC is totally self-contained and that the act of verifying needs no connection back to the issuer is a really important concept. So one brief slide, try to keep this totally non-technical, except 2 slides. This is one of them. It's just for the record, for those that are interested to drill down into it. A VC is made up of 3 chunks: a standard header, when was it issued, who issued it, what was the date of issue, and so on. The subject, which is where all the variability is. The subject for a certificate of origin will be completely different to the subject for a commercial invoice or a driver's license. But the data in the subject must be described by a web vocabulary pointed at somewhere. And then the proof, that's the digital signature bit. And there are various different kinds of proofs, including some that support that selective redaction. This is just re-emphasizing that comment I made earlier, that it's a digital credential, but it has built in a rendering template. So the digital data sits there encrypted, but you can look at it on a piece of paper and see that digital data rendered on that familiar format. And because of that, you can completely decouple from the technical maturity of the verifier, right? So here I've got someone who might just scan that QR code with their phone. What's happening behind the scenes is it's going to a verifier site that's getting the credential, verifying and showing the result. But similarly, a machine can process exactly the same thing and verify it itself and extract all the data as if it had been sent system to system, end to end. Right. So that duality is a really powerful scalability mechanism, because it means issuers can just choose to go 100% digital without any dependency on prior arrangements with verifiers. Right. And that matters for cross-border trade. So why would you want to use a VC, or when would you want to use a VC? Well, or when you want to issue one, whenever you're making any kind of assertion or attestation of value to you or your customers, right? Some examples: a degree certificate. Issuer is a university, holder is a student, verifier might be an employer. Driver's license, issuer state authority, holder a resident, verifier might be a bottle shop checking age. A working holiday visa, issuer's Department of Home Affairs, holder is a traveler, a verifier is somebody who might be selling you a SIM card or offering you a job. Even a bank statement issued by a bank to me, showing it to a rental agency and verifying that really is the amount in my account. And you can think of 1,000 more examples like that. There's an awful lot of documents and credentials that are part of everyday life that somebody cares to verify. And that's the key criteria. So the next thing, just quickly, what is a decentralized identifier? So far, we've talked about VCs, but not about DIDs. So in short, it's a self-assigned identity or identifier assigned by about either an organization or a device or a product or a person, can be assigned to anything. And these identifiers are typically either the issuer or the subject or both in a verifiable credential, or they don't have to be. And the key idea here is that they're self-issued, and they're often meaningless numbers. Right? So you might say, and I think I've just said that, right? So they're self-issued, they're globally unique. A key feature of them too is they're resolvable. In other words, if I know the identifier, I can find further information about it, such as key pairs and services and so on and so forth. There's an example of one. There are various different types of DID methods, and this one is DID web, but there's also DID key, DID ether, DID this and DID that. There's probably about 100 of them, but only 3 or 4 that matter. Like I said, they're meaningless identifiers. So the question that you might obviously ask is, so what? Why would I want to issue myself a meaningless identifier? The answer is, painted through this little scenario here. They're basically the glue between VCs to form trust graphs, or to link claims to deeper evidence, right? So imagine I create a key pair and I call it DID key 1234. It doesn't matter what it is, but the point is I can prove I own it. I might log into MyGovID to the ATO, for example, and I've obviously, through logging in with MyGovID, I've proven that who I am to the ATO. But I've also proved that I own DID key 1234 by signing a challenge. ATO can then issue me a digital version of that business registration certificate that I showed you before, that basically says ATO, a trust anchor, someone you trust, says that DID 1234 is ABN 341243446. So there's basically a link made here between a random identifier that I own and an attestation from government about who that identifier is. Why does that matter? Because the next thing I might do is send an invoice to a supplier, to a customer, signed with my DID. I have to sign it with my DID because I can't sign it with the ATO's DID. I don't own it. And that means that that business can verify that that invoice genuinely came from me and hasn't been tampered with. But without that connection with through my DID to the ATO credential, all I know is this invoice was issued by DID 1234 and it hasn't been tampered with. That doesn't help me with know your customer identity integrity. But if I can link it to another certificate that says ATO says DID 1234 is that Australian business, now I've satisfied my know your customer regulation. For example, one value of that is evidently the Asian Development Bank estimates that about $1.7 trillion of trade finance per year is available but not provided because of applications rejected. And the overwhelming reason for those rejections is that the bank doesn't have sufficient identity integrity of the parties or document integrity of the documents. So if you could do this simple scenario here of attaching your document integrity to a government attested identity, you might be able to get access to a lot more trade finance. So this idea of anchoring a claim to another claim that has integrity is really fundamental. And that's the value of DIDs. They allow me to make that connection without that business having to log into ATO or knowing anything about or having to have any sort of relying party relationship with ATO. They can just confirm that that thing was signed by ato.gov.au. I know who that is and I trust them. And so this is just beginning to introduce the idea of trust graphs, right? Here's another one. I won't go into the details, but product conformity is another sort of typical trust relationship claim, right? There are tens of thousands of labs and certifying businesses that will go on your farm or your facility and test something and give you a certificate. But as a verifier on the other side of the world, how do I distinguish between a certifier who is generally authorized to do that and my brother that decided to create a technically valid verifiable credential, but I don't have the authority, business authority to do it? Again, it's a chain of trust question, right? So if NATA or someone like that, NATA is the Australian National Accreditation Authority for Test Labs, and JASANS for other kinds of certification, were to issue the certifying body with a certificate that says NATA accredits ACME certifiers to test cotton for organic qualities, for example. Then the verifier at the other end of the chain doesn't need to know whether ACME, ACME. He just needs to confirm that ACME has been accredited. So this is very similar to the ATO identifying me as a party so that I can sign an invoice so that the supplier can get trade finance. It's this idea of a chain of credentials ending up in something you trust, like a government entity, NATA, or whatever. So having rushed through a little bit what's a verifiable credential and what's a DID and why do they matter, the short answer is to produce these digital claims that can be linked together to form trust graphs that can make high integrity information available through supply chains. How would that apply to cross-border supply chains and ESG concerns? So first, let's look at why this is increasingly a concern. We're seeing evidence around the world of increasing regulation in this space, right? So for example, the EU deforestation regulation will say that EU won't import any products that have passed through any property that has had any natural cover deforestation in the last 4 years. And that rule comes into place in 1 year's time. It's also putting in rules about ESG claims in battery passports, how much carbon intensity and how much circularity and so on. It's also about to put in carbon border adjustment mechanism where tariffs will be applied on the border. And interestingly, because offsets are so, let's say, politely unreliable, the EU rules will demand that offsets be stripped. They won't consider them. You'll have to prove natural inset. In other words, you've done something with your industrial process to actually reduce your carbon. You haven't just bought cheap offsets. And other countries are beginning to follow suit. Australia has already announced consultation on border tariffs. It doesn't mean it's going to apply them, but consultation has started. And so other economies are following. China has just aggregated an enormous number of border compliance agencies into customs for the purposes of enforcing these sort of things at the border. And not only the regulation, but also there is a very important change from the organization that for 20, 30, 40 years now, I'm not sure how long, has defined global standards for financial reporting. It's very important that investors into companies can confidently interpret a balance sheet or a profit and loss account consistently. Same rules have been applied. And IFRS are those rules. Now they've released another standard, which is in parallel to corporate financial reporting. It's corporate sustainability reporting. And investment agencies, banks, investment funds, etc., are paying careful attention to this, What it means is if you're a business and you're seeking investment and you can't prove your sustainability credentials, you're likely to get less investment. So, but in short, that these concerns are changing from, I think, from marketing and social license type concerns to regulatory compliance and financial concerns, which means that the importance of evidence behind them is increasing. It used to be you just make a claim. It might have been greenwashing. In fact, 60% or 70% of them were greenwashing, but it kind of didn't matter because it was social license only. Now you make a claim and it's legally enforceable. So parties along the supply chain are going to want more confidence and evidence behind those claims. That's an assertion. So supply chain traceability and transparency will be more important. So now the world is basically full of what you might call a graveyard of traceability pilots that kick off, do something, and then fizzle. Why do they fizzle? Well, a number of reasons. One of them might be the previous slide, not enough business incentive, but another one is an implementation architecture that's fundamentally broken. Right? A lot of these traceability pilots have an operating model that where you pick a technology platform, yours or my blockchain or something, and ask each participant in the supply chain to provide their data to that platform so that the platform can draw an end-to-end traceability picture. Conceptually, it works, but it'll never scale. It's kind of, I think, logically like saying, if we all want to pay each other, everybody on this call, it all works fine so long as we all have an account at the same bank. But we don't, do we? We have accounts at different banks in different countries, and their money can flow because of SWIFT. So really, that centralized architecture for traceability can never scale at beyond a certain local community, maybe, but no more than that. So we need a different protocol or a different method. So basically replacing a platform with a protocol that looks more like this, where every actor in the supply chain who ships products attaches evidence to those products. And there's a protocol by which the evidence can be followed across the supply chain. It's like pulling on a piece of thread and discovering the little bits of information that are relevant only to that thread to draw the traceability picture, where all data remains with the natural owner of the data. I believe that's a much more scalable architecture, and it's naturally aligned with verifiable credentials and DIDs because they are themselves a decentralized digital trust architecture. So the assertion here is that VCs and DIDs are the solution to scalable, globally scalable traceability and transparency. A little look here at one, this is actually our project, or I haven't put our brand in, an example of how that might work in the beef supply chain. So in Australia, every cow is tagged with a unique ID called an NLAS ID that identifies the property and the cow. And we can imagine, basically the philosophy behind this architecture is that given a product ID, I can always find information about that product that meets my needs from a sustainability perspective. So the first thing I've got to do is know where to look. So the issuer of the ID maintains a register that says, for that farm, this is where you look. So I go and through a thing called a link resolver, get a livestock passport that basically describes the carbon and deforestation and whatever credentials about that cow. However, that's about a cow. Farms don't manage at that granularity. They manage at the property level. So here's a farm with all kinds of credentials about its land cover and so on and so forth, managing at farm level. Somebody needs to do an allocation between the farm and the cow, or the farm and a consignment at least, because that's the unit of purchase at the next level of the supply chain. So on-farm software can typically do that. Right? So we got an architecture here where basically farms are proving their environmental integrity at farm level and using tools to allocate that to the unit of shipment. Exactly the same thing might happen in a meat processor. Here's a meat processor that may happen to be running SAP, back-end system, except this time the identifiers of products are not NLAS IDs, they're GS1 GTINs, but exactly the same architecture works. Given the identity on that package of meat, I can look at a GS1 global register and say, where do I look for further information? And it'll say, in this case, go to that link resolver that's chosen by that facility, and I'll get the meat product passport. So now I've got a mechanism here basically for given an identity of a thing to find the ESG credentials about a thing. But what I haven't seen yet is the traceability bit. How do I connect these two chains, right? So that's where GS1 EPCIS standards come into play, where that meat processor may publish a transformation event, which is a really short little message that basically says, or a credential really, that says these inputs were processed to create that list of outputs. And that gives a mechanism to trace, because now, given that meat parcel, I can get its credential, but I can also follow that transformation event to get credentials about the inputs, which are the cows, and even if I want to, follow that further to get credentials about the farm and do audits. And similarly for buying and selling transactions. Right? And one of the key ideas here too is that these passports are deliberately as simple as they possibly can be, so that just the right information is passed along the supply chain that's needed at the next step. All the complexity is behind audits. I'm doing pretty well on time. I might have been talking too fast, I don't know, but I think this is near the last slide. What are we doing to contribute to all this? Well, got a few projects running in Australia. One of them is a beef traceability project, along the lines of what you just saw. Another one is a steel and construction traceability project. Building constructors have similar challenges with keeping track of all the materials that go into a building and their integrity and ESG compliance. We work closely with global organizations like GS1, but we don't buy stuff from them and they don't buy stuff from us. So it's a mutual friendship, not any sort of dependency. And we work at global level. So as was mentioned, we published a white paper on verifiable credentials for trade. There's a link to that white paper there, which basically gives a lot more detailed story of information that supports what I've just said. And we're just kicking off a new project next week, which is to, a bit like recommendation 33, which most people have never heard of, but if I say that's the trade single window recommendation, then everybody goes, that's what it is. So UNECE issues these recommendations to nations. Some of them are quite significant, like recommendation 33 on trade single windows. We're about to write recommendation 49 on giving advice to nations on implementing transparency at scale, which will reflect a lot of the ideas presented in this presentation. And through that, also develop things like a global standard digital product passport, because there's a plethora of them at the moment. And not saying that it'll replace all the plethora out there, but at least it'll give a place someone can look at if they're making their own. So that's about my story on what is a verifiable credential, what's a decentralized identifier, why does it matter, and how does it apply to this emerging concern of supply chain traceability and ESG compliance. So end of show. Time for questions. I can bring back certain slides if someone wants to see them. Otherwise, I'll shut my presentation. I can't see the questions channel, can you?
I can. So, but if you close your presentation, that's good. Thank you very much, Steve, for that. And the slides will be available afterwards, and the recording of this webinar will also be available on our website. But there's a clarification question came up through your presentation when you had the slide relating to the MyGov ID and the ATO, and wondering whether or not this is all hypothetical or whether it's, actually in place and can be used now. What's the status of things, Steve?
That's a good question. So many governments around the world are recognizing that identity of both citizens and business is actually a national asset. It's national infrastructure. It's like roads, right? And so you can look at the EU digital wallet and the New Zealand, I forget what they call it, the My something, and Singapore's SingPass. These are all initiatives that are about opening up government identity to be reused in the business to business and business to consumer sector. Now, up till now, as you probably know, MyGov ID has only been usable for authenticating people and businesses to government, not for people and businesses to prove their identity to non-government entities. And if you think about it, we probably identify ourselves to government a few times a year, but we send invoices or we interact with non-government entities thousands of times more often. So the real power of that government identity is released when it's accessible and usable to prove identity to non-government entities. Now, the Australian government has recognized that, and there is a project underway, and there has been some announcements already about empowering citizens to prove their identity. And it basically is triggered by the Optus fiasco that happened about a year ago, so that citizens can prove their identity, for example, to Optus without releasing all their private information. So I don't believe, it's not done yet, but there's clear progress towards a government initiative to empower all of us as citizens with personal government evidenced identity. I have not heard anything similar from the tax office about empowering business to prove their business identity. So anyone on the call that knows the tax office and wants to shake the tree should do so, I would say.
Thanks, Steve. So I guess to extrapolate, that's an Australian one. Is there any nation in the world doing this that Australians might respond to as part of their supply chain?
Yeah, like I said, Singapore, as usual, often leads the world on these things. So SingPass is a citizen and business credential in Singapore that is a decentralized architecture that can be used to prove your business or citizen identity to any third party of your choice. So they're live and been running with that for some years. The EU is doing it on a huge scale, but they're not live with it yet, but the initiative is there. And I think there's other countries. Canada is quite well down the track on this as well. And there's lots of papers out about using verifiable credentials and DIDs to empower businesses and citizens with identity. And basically, if you think about it, many businesses and government agencies have a pattern where they provide a service where the output is some credential of value, whether it's a degree certificate or a doctor's or a referral to a MRI or whatever it is. It's a thing that has value and needs to be verified by another party, and often have inputs that actually also, if they were higher integrity, would improve the process. You know, if you could improve your fit and proper person or your police check digitally, a lot of processes would be more streamlined. I think around the world, organizations and government entities are waking up to the power of this decentralized trust architecture, and seeking, wherever you're acting as a kind of a trust anchor, have an important role about issuing something that's widely valuable, starting to do so digitally. So Engin said, how does the time frame look when you think about more than 50% transfer? Yeah, so look, the uptake of genuinely traceable and transparent supply chains, and if you were to count it as a percentage of consignments that are traceable, I don't know the number, but I'd hazard it's less than a tiny fraction of 1%. And so you've got a long way to go before more of them are traceable. And what we're trying to do here is make the pathway towards achieving that more scalable and lower cost. What program? Key management solutions for organizations. Yeah. So, well, there's a lot of yeah, that example. I think what's behind Hugo's question is when I showed a verifiable credential with a holder, we all sort of imagined an individual with a mobile wallet on their phone. But how does that work when you're a large organization? You need a kind of an enterprise wallet. There are a number of products out there, and even Microsoft has a verifiable credential-based enterprise wallet. So, enterprise DIDs and the key pairs associated with them are managed by those products. One of the kind of powers of self-sovereign identity too is that you can basically issue as many of them as you like. So let's say your privacy concern is, I want to make sure that I don't leak identity across business interactions. I can make 100 DIDs if I want, if they're all tied to the same trust anchor. It's putting a lot of power back in the hands of the individual and the organization. Of course, they've got to know how to use it, and good products will make that simpler. Peter's got a question here. Can you elaborate on the use case where one trading partner continues to use paper-based? Yeah, so that slide that showed the digital credential encrypted and referenced by a QR code is a technique really for managing the situation. And this is probably not uncommon in things like certificates of origin, right? Where a trade document is touched or handled by many different parties with all kinds of different levels of maturity. So let's take a certificate of origin, and Brian is a master of these and will correct me if I'm wrong here, but typically issued by a chamber of commerce to a trader, an exporter, who will then bundle it up, give it with other documents to the freight forwarder, who will send it with the goods to the other country importer, who may want to get trade finance, and it's one of the supporting documents, might present it to a bank. Then they'll hand it over to the importing country customs broker, who will then submit it to the importing customs authority. And if it's a preferential certificate of origin, that authority will go, yep, you do or you don't have a preferential duty rate. So how many hands did that certificate of origin go through before it ended up with the importing authority? 5 or 6 at my last count, right? So if you needed all of those hands to be digitally mature and to be able to exchange digital data for the digital data to be accessible to the importing customs authority, then you'd be waiting a long time and not get anywhere, right? So the beauty of a human readable verifiable credential is that the issuing authority, let's say ACITI in Australia, can issue a digital one with a PDF rendering with a QR on it. Anyone along the supply chain can scan the QR and say, ACITI certifies that this is a certificate of origin, here's the original, hasn't been tampered with, just with a mobile phone. But the importing customs authority can choose to follow the same QR code, get the credential itself, verify it itself, and not trust ACITI's verifier, and extract the data and consume it as if it had been sent electronically end to end, right? So you've got one issued digital document that accommodates all kinds of technical maturity along the supply chain. And effectively, you've gone digital, paper, 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 digital, which is an interesting pattern, right? And quite important, I think, in long supply chains, because you just can't expect everybody to grow with the same maturity. I don't know if that answers Peter's question. Is government, Rachel has said, is government a key partner in driving adoption of these trust chains, or can business drive this? Yeah, so I think business are the primary issuers. The big volume of credentials are things like product conformity certificates, commercial invoices, and so on. The much lower volume of credentials are the things that those would link to that give them trust, right? So, for example, that if ATO had such a service and I could get a digital credential asserting that I am ABN such and such GoSource, I'd only need that once or twice a year to refresh it maybe, but I can send 100 invoices a day, right? So I think there's an obligation here, and we'll be writing this in our advice to nations, that there's a role for regulators or trust anchors in general, right? Regulators are obvious trust anchors, but so are accreditation authorities or standards bodies or whatever. To even GS1, there are various IP organizations that trust anchors as well. To issue whatever they do today, if you issue a registration certificate or some sort of evidence of accreditation, do so digitally and do so to the customer's DID, so that the multiplier effect can happen. So it's mostly business, but you've got to shake the tree of government to add trust to the thing you do. So there's nothing stopping business doing all this now without that government trust anchor. It's just that the verifier would need to know that DID 1234 is GoSource, and I've had some other way to prove that. Whereas if I can link it to my ATO certificate, then they don't need to know that. I don't know if that answers the question. So yeah, there is an onus here on trust anchors to basically be trust anchors, but do so digitally. It's not actually changing the business process that they all do today, right? The ATO issues business registration certificates, and Medicare issues Medicaid cards, and states issue driver's licenses. Just do what you do today, but do it digitally, and do it to the subjects did, and you empower an enormous multiplier effect on a digital economy.
So, Steve, just for clarity, you said the ATO is not considering this, and the ATO and ASIC obviously issue tax file numbers and company registration details and things that really core base information. What would it take for them to do it? What do they need to do?
I think pressure from business. So I wouldn't say they're not doing it. I would say I don't know whether they are, because I haven't seen anything. I don't work for ATO. Maybe they have got an internal project they haven't announced yet. I don't know. I just haven't seen anything in the press about government looking to provide business with high integrity identity that they can leverage. Only citizens. So if I was business, I'd be writing to my minister and through organizations that are lobby groups like ACITI, perhaps.
Well, we're not an advocacy group, but we're happy to make sure good ideas get some airing. So Peter Carter has sort of asked that question around, if you had a magic wand, what would you do?
Well, of course, there's a lot of things we'd want agencies to do, but strictly in the context of digital verifiable credentials, I would want agencies to look at all the things they issue today as paper or PDF and ask themselves which ones have material value to the economy. One of the challenges here is that most government agencies, when they think about their regulatory role, think about the interaction between the regulated party and the agency. They think often a lot less about the interaction between the regulated party and others, right? And so, agencies will think about how can we improve value to business by streamlining our service, better websites, all this sort of thing. It's all about the interaction between the citizen and business and the agency. There's nothing wrong with that, of course, but rarely do they ask themselves, this thing that I issue, this piece of paper, which is an ABN certificate, what would be the value to industry if I did that digitally? Right? And the answer is potentially enormous, right? $1.7 trillion, that's worldwide, not Australia, of trade finance. And that's just one example. So I don't really see that question being asked often enough because that's the business incentive to do it.
So, Steve, you used an example of ACITI's form there. Australia, I think, only accepts an ACITI's document from New Zealand. Yeah. There are a number of other countries who are trialling that as a system. I'm not certain if they're issued in Australia where they're acceptable in reverse, but just to follow the example along, you've got traders who they're registered themselves, they deal with conformity inside the Australian domestic economy. And your meat example, the exporter might have been an authorized in order to export, for example, into certain countries. Can you start attaching all of those things, and they're in a wallet that's acceptable to various agencies as they pass along the supply chain? Is that the sort of thing we should be envisaging, rather than, again, these monolithic things where an agency has to hold everything and another agency has to request it? And as we move along, you have all of this in and out of government agencies. Can we actually envisage a different system?
Yes, I think we can, and it can potentially be a lot more scalable faster. So a good example might be phytosanitary certs or e-certs, right? So Australia has been world leading in implementing e-certs, but the implementation model is to establish a direct connection between the Australian government and the counterparty in the other country. And so that's a system-to-system integration along which e-certs are sent. So that's great, but how scalable is it? It's taken about 10 years to get 10 countries on board. And even having done that, there are cases where that e-cert needs to be visible by a party other than the two governments. And so you print out a paper one anyway, right? So I think a more scalable approach to achieve exactly the same thing is just to issue all the e-certs as verifiable credentials, decoupling that dependency on direct connections with other countries, because to create those direct connections, you need a project with funding, and that project has to have funding for both nations at the same time. You know how hard it is to get a funded project going in government, and to get it happening with two countries. You know, this is why it's taken 10 years to get 10 countries. But government could just issue these government credentials as digitally verifiable credentials, 100%, all of them now. And it'd be up to the receiving country how they treat it. Maybe they pull their phone out and scan it, or maybe they integrate with it. But you've decoupled that dependency on needing two countries to get together to establish a project to exchange data directly. And not only that, you've empowered anyone along the supply chain who also needs it to see it and verify it. So yeah, I think exactly the same business process, which essentially in a business sense is a government-to-government transaction, right? An e-cert. It's a competent authority in one country making an assertion to a competent authority in another. But I think the mistake is not in that model, but in the implementation, which says for that to work, I've got to send that data as an XML payload between two countries. You don't actually. You just need to put that data in a verifiable credential, give it to the holder, and they'll present it to as many countries as they need to, and as many parties as they need to. You leave it up to the importing country to mature their technology at their leisure to switch from scanning a thing with a mobile phone to full integration, right? So I think, yeah, it's all about scalability, right? And a lot of the work we're doing and with the UN is addressing these reasons why things happen slowly, and what can you do to make them happen faster and cheaper? And this is one of them.
So Peter Carter's got some follow-on questions there around, is it just like the same technology that enables me to download airline tickets or theatre tickets into a personal wallet? Is that what we're talking about, but a business case?
Yeah, I mean,
and how do we make the selective disclosure of information?
Well, on the selective disclosure question, there's a short answer and a long answer. We've only got time for the short answer, which is it's a particular kind of cryptographic proof that allows a holder to obscure a bit of data in a verifiable credential without affecting the integrity of the signature. How it does that gets into zero-knowledge proofs and a bit beyond the time we've got left to discuss it. But the fact is, and this is one of the beauties of the thing, is that I can hide information that I choose not to pass on without affecting the integrity of the thing I pass on. That's quite a powerful idea, right? What else?
Okay, then we have Rio. Is this compatible with the MATLA, Model Law on Electronically Transferable Records, and UNCITRAL at the legislative level?
So UNCITRAL is a broad framework for electronic trade documents. MLETR is a bit of a special case for a particular type of document, which is a title deed and is a transferable right. Right. So there are several of these, but the most obvious one is the Ocean Bill of Lading. The difference between an Ocean Bill of Lading and any other document is, in terms of its integrity, is an invoice or a certificate or whatever is something somebody issues. You can make 20 copies of it, and the key question is it valid or not? Can I trust it? Whereas an Ocean Bill of Lading, when you hand over the document, you're actually handing over title to the deeds, right? So MLETR and Ocean Bills of Lading are a bit different. It's compatible with this, but needs one extra thing. So in a nutshell, I should say VCs and DIDs handle all kinds of documents, even Ocean Bills of Lading, except that you need something else, which is proof of unique ownership and transfer. And that thing by the way, all of DIDs, everything I said about DIDs and VCs has no dependency on blockchain, except MLETR and transferable records. The easiest way to implement that electronically is something called an NFT, a non-fungible token. So you can imagine Ocean Bills of Lading being implemented as basically verifiable credentials plus non-fungible tokens. But that's the rare case of value in blockchain. In most cases, blockchain is in my opinion, a worthless expense in cross-border trade integrity. But there are cases where it matters, and this is one of them.
Thanks, Steve. I also wanted to bring you back to that. What does an agency need to do, right? If an Australian agency wants to issue a verifiable credential, what technology do they need to have? Is there something, again, you just, buy it off the shelf somewhere, or it's...
Yeah, so there's heaps of very high quality open source products. It's basically a plugin to your existing business systems. It's remarkably easy to do. Anecdotally, this beef supply chain story that I showed, we're just at the end of sprint 1 on that. And this morning we did show the thing, the typical end of sprint 1 demo, where we showed scanning a barcode and finding the link resolver and getting the verifiable credential and verifying the credential. And we did it with 2 parties. Us was one of them. And we've got an excuse because we know these things, done it for a while. So it wasn't hard for us to achieve that in 2 weeks. But the interesting observation is there was one other party there, a commercial company, and 2 weeks ago didn't know how to spell verifiable credentials and DIDs. And 2 weeks later, they're issuing verifiable credentials anchored to their DIDs as product passports about livestock out of their farm system. So, it wasn't that hard, basically. So the message to every agency is you don't need to change your business processes. You don't need to change your internal business systems. You just got to plug in a little bit of technology, which can be open source or commercial, to issue what you issue today, except digitally as a verifiable credential. Now, I'm not saying it would take the tax office 2 weeks, but agencies tend to take longer and do it more seriously. But we're talking small projects, not big projects, to do this.
And I'm interested in crime prevention. So I've set one of these up, but my business is actually in defrauding the supply chain and supplying empty containers for which I get paid, against fraudulent claims. This is my business. How does it prevent that from going on?
There's all kinds of attack vectors, and a lot of them are to do with identity theft, and it depends where in the supply chain you're attacking, right? So if I'm a border agency and I'm concerned about veracity of cargo reports or import declarations, is the exporter really who they claim to be? Is the consignee consignor really who they claim to be, or are they piggybacking on a trusted identity? Because most of these documents and processes, the identities are just claimed, not verified, right? I can lodge an import declaration and look up in the ABR any business I choose and claim to be that business on the import declaration. So in terms of making that harder to do, if government agencies that have business processes that depend on integrity of input documents, instead of getting let's say a cargo report from the dodgy freight forwarder, got digitally signed bills of lading from the issuer, it would be very hard to go in there and substitute the consignor information, right, which is one of the piggybacking vectors. So, but by thinking about meeting government regulations through observing high integrity natural business documents in the supply chain, you actually provide both an efficiency dividend, because I don't have to fill in reports, I just give you my documents, but you also provide a compliance dividend because it's much harder to fake them. Right? I don't know if that answers the question. There's also questions about counterfeiting and other things, but you have to look at each attack vector and show how it's improved.
Well, that's certainly one of the accusations around certificates of origin you mentioned is they get verified in foreign country because foreign country doesn't trust that they were issued correctly, and there is some basis for having that attitude because of the levels of fraud which does go on. If this is the type of technology that could help solve that, I think it's a tremendous advance.
Well, it can make the verification instant, right? And you can't argue with it. So today, if a government decides to hold up an Australian shipment because they suspect the certificate of origin is a fake, the process to prove that it isn't a fake takes several days, by which time your prawns have rotted on the wharf, right? And so the process to prove it's not a fake with a digitally verifiable credential is instant because it's signed by ABF.
Excellent. Well, we don't have any more questions. We're running up against the end of time, but that's been a tremendous session, Steve. You've given us exposure to the technology, exposure to what some of its use cases might be, given us some information around how quickly and easily this could be deployed if government agencies had a mind to do it and businesses had a mind to do it. What's the next step? You said next week there's some meetings on which will help to verify this. What's going to go on there? And then once agreed, what's the next step?
So I mean, there's a lot of projects running independently. Next week, physically, I'm in Bangkok at a UN CEFACT forum where we're launching that recommendation 49 I mentioned about advice to nations, which will make explicit some of the suggestions I've just made, but coming from the UN, and hopefully maybe somebody will listen and do something about it. So that there's kind of steps at the kind of trying to influence global opinion and behavior through the UN with what limited influence it has. Although I was surprised how widespread the readership of that verifiable credentials paper that we wrote was. It had quite a lot of impact, and I suspect recommendation 49 could do as well. But irrespective of all that, any organization that issues something of value today, a bank statement, a degree certificate, police check, business registration, whatever, should and can be doing that digitally. And can do it in such a way that it doesn't disrupt the current paper processes, right? It can manifest as just that magic QR in the corner. It's, of course, everybody's familiar with QRs, but this is a particular kind of QR that isn't just read more information. It's actually a link to an encrypted credential, which you can verify and process. So not all QRs are the same, is the message there. And there is an easy way without massive disruption to current processes to digitize these documents. And whether you present them as a piece of paper with a QR on it, or whether they're presented into the holder's digital wallet, those are just delivery mechanisms, and you can have both of them, but you don't depend on their holder having a wallet before you start.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. It's been a tremendously interesting session. As I said, we've recorded this. It will be made available publicly, and slides associated with it. Next week's presentation on Wednesday will be with GS1, and Peter Carter will give us a rundown on some work they've been doing on automation of HS codes, which should be fairly interesting as well from the barcode that products commonly use. So please join me next week for that one, but thank Steve today, and thank you all for your time and interest and questions. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks all. Thanks for listening. And thanks, Brian. All right.